Hi everyone, and welcome to my shop. If you've purchased one of my BedrosianWoodworks Fritz and Franz jigs, you will have also received a Word document with all of the steps to set up and calibrate the jig. I'm going to go through each of those steps in this video. The first step is to use a 7/16 inch wrench to loosen the nuts that hold the stops in place so you can remove them. And take note that the pivoting arm on the stop should be on the right side of the stop for both of the blocks when you reassemble the jig and put the stops back on. So we can just slide these off and set them aside for now. The next step is to remove the two movable faces using the provided Allen key. And if you have the jig oriented this way with the 0 on the tape measure to the right, the B face will be closer to you and the A face will be away from you. And this is important because when you replace these, you need to make sure that you put the B on this side and the A on this side. I've flipped the jig up so you can see how the faces are attached. Each face has 3 machine screws that thread into a T-nut that is in this slot. So when you remove the machine screw, make sure you don't lose that T-nut, and there are 3 of them with each face. After removing the faces, you'll see that I've penciled in a B here, and there's an A on the opposite side, and that corresponds to the face. So there shouldn't be any confusion on which face goes where. If you're following along with the Word document, we're now on step 2, where I've positioned the A side of the jig against the fence on my outrigger. And I've also moved the jig along so that the right side of the jig overlaps with about half the width of the saw blade. And this is the position we want the jig to be in when we're using it. So now what we can do is we can pencil in where the runner should be located on the jig using this slot. Step 4 of the instruction says to machine a runner that fits snugly in the slot in your sliding table. And I've used UHMW for this runner, but you can use a hard wood. I recommend something that's quarter sawn and very hard. And you want the runner to be a good fit in the slot, but it does have to slide. So you don't want any play, but you want the runner to be able to move back and forth. You need to attach the runner to the bottom of the jig where you've got the pencil line where the slot is in your sliding table. And I find the best way to do that is to route a groove the same width as the runner. And you can do this at your router table, or you could use a dado set at your table saw. So do that step now to route that groove that's just the same width as your runner. So you've cut the slot in the underside of the jig, but don't install the runner yet. We need to cut the jig into 2 pieces first. So rotate it 90 degrees, and you'll see I've got a pencil line drawn on the jig where you should cut the jig in 2. Make sure your fence is perpendicular to your saw blade. That's very important. And I recommend using the 0 side of the jig. So slide the jig along until the cut line is in the middle of your saw blade, and then cut the jig in 2. After cutting the jig in 2, you should cut your runners to length and attach those. And then you can also attach the faces, making sure you've got the A and the B face oriented correctly. Use the machine screw that I provide to attach the plastic handle to the wooden block, and then secure that to the A portion of the jig so that the handle is in line with the runner. That way, as you're pushing the jig forward or back, there's no tendency to twist because you're right in line with the runner. At this point, you're almost done. The B portion of the jig should be tight against the fence on your sliding table. If you don't have a fence in this position, you want something to hold the B portion stationary. So you could have a block of wood back here, or you could clamp this down to your sliding table. The A side of the fence is the movable slide, and that's why it's longer, so that the runner has more support within the sliding table. And the workpiece is going to be trapped between the faces when you're making a cut. You're now ready to cut the jig so that it's flush with the left side of the saw blade. So if you recall, when we set up the position of the runner, the right side of the jig was overlapping with about half the width of the saw blade. We now need to cut that off. And before you do that, just make sure that your runners don't extend out too far, because you want to cut off as little of the runner as needed. So once you do that, you can turn on your saw, you can slide your carriage through and make that cut. When you do that, both the MDF and the face will be flush with the left side of the blade. But over time, if you use a wider blade or if there's any wobble, both of these surfaces will wear. And what you can do in that case, you can't do anything with the MDF, but you can always slide this face, the B face and the A face, you can slide it to the right and make a fresh cut. So you've always got this edge referenced to the left side of the blade. You can now slide the stops back onto the T-track on the jig, remembering that this folding arm should be on the right side of the stop. And you also want to replace the nut that I used with these handles that are included with the jig. It's time to calibrate the jig, which I do using a 1-2-3 machinist block. And what I do is I position the block just lightly against the carbide teeth, making sure that the teeth is contacting the block rather than in one of the holes. And so, as I said, just lightly. And then I take the stop and I lightly push it against the block. So this is 3 inches. I know now that this side of the stop is 3 inches from the blade. And I can then look at the cursor here. There's a line which you may not be able to see very well on camera, but I can loosen this screw and move the cursor laterally until it's right on 3 inches. And once I've done that, this stop is calibrated. I can do the same for the back stop here, and I'm good to go. Later, if you're using a saw blade that's wider or thinner, you can redo that calibration step. You can move the cursor here so that you're always calibrated regardless of the saw blade that you're using. That's it. Your jig is now ready to use. You can store the Allen key for the faces on the magnets that are on the jig, so it's always handy when you need it. And your stops are ready to go. You can flip them out of the way when you don't need them and flip them down to make very accurate cuts. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Thanks for watching.